client number 3 sitting down with individual 1. Allow me to explain. It's a very 2019 story. Donald Trump went to speak with another fellow former Michael Cohen client, Sean Hannity, to attack Cohen's allegations that Trump was behind that hush money scheme to pay off Stormy Daniels.
He said to me at least a dozen times that he made the decision on the payments and he didn't tell you.
Yeah.
Told me personally.
No, he did, and he made the decision. And remember this, he's an attorney. Whatever decision he makes, you're supposed to rely on an attorney to make a decision. When you have an attorney, you're supposed to be able to rely on your attorney.
Attorney-client privilege?
But it's also called reliance.
He knows what he's doing. Reliance is an actual defense, although not to committing a crime. Now, if Donald Trump didn't tell Cohen to make those hush money payments, if Cohen just decided to pay Stormy Daniels, all out of the blue, why did Trump pay for it? Cohen has the receipts, of course, and he showed them to Congress. Today, Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, tried to explain.
We brought out 10 months ago that he made the payments. It's our view of it that the president didn't know about it at the time. And then the president, when he found out about it, made arrangements for reimbursement.
Nobody really buys that, and Donald Trump is well known to not spend a lot of money. He is considered by many of his former co-workers notoriously cheap. Now, hundreds of people have actually sued him for not paying back what he owed. That means things he authorized, like dishwashers, painters, bartenders, and yes, quite relevant tonight, lawyers. Former federal prosecutor John Flannery was special counsel to 3 congressional investigations, and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade knows her way around these issues. John, I see you moving around in your chair, but you're ready. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you. Absolutely.
Reliance. Do you buy it?
No, I don't. And Reliance, it's very interesting what these guys do. Reliance is based on this platonic ideal of an attorney, and that's not what he wanted. He didn't want an attorney. He wanted a fixer. He wanted a crook with a title. He wanted a person who could do what he needed done, and he didn't care at all about the law. This guy has a whole line of these people, starting with Mr. Cohen, the famous get the communists who associated him with mobsters and told him always to fight and always to make demands and everything else. So there's no reason to believe for an instant that Reliance and Sean Hannity, what a pair, talking about this as if they know what an attorney is and that's what they want to have done. That's not at all what this was about.
Yeah, I thought, and I say this in all fairness, Barbara, I thought this was one of those rebuttals and defenses that really showed they have no ground left. And there are decent defenses. We've covered them on this show. They're good defenses, for example, to alleged collusion. But this seemed wild. So I have a short question for you, followed by a longer one, Barbara. My short question is, have you ever seen one former client interview another former client of a lawyer going to jail about what one client allegedly did?
Short answer, no.
No. I mean, again, it's easy to forget in 2019. Sean Hannity says he paid Michael Cohen to be his lawyer. That right there is a huge conflict of interest for that interview. Number 2, of course, is the longer question to you. If Michael Cohen is right and the checks are right and they're in evidence, and this is ultimately going to be resolved in evidentiary proceedings, not in the 2 clients of Michael Cohen interviewing each other proceedings. What does it mean legally, Barbara, that he brought those checks and that there was that multi-person, I don't want to use the word conspiracy, but multi-person project to pay that money back, Trump org money to help a campaign?
Well, anyone who participated in a conspiracy to pay these monies back, knowing that they weren't going to be disclosed on campaign finance forms, could be guilty of a conspiracy. And how you prove that? We don't have to rely solely on the word of Michael Cohen. There will be other evidence. They can talk to Alan Weisselberg, for example, who, according to that recording, participated in that conversation as well. So the checks are some evidence. One thing that you have to prove for campaign finance violations that's a little different from some other crimes crimes is that it was committed willfully. That's the highest level of
Higher
mens
bar,
rea
yeah.
or intent. You have to show that they not only knew what they were doing, but they knew it was illegal. But a great way to show that is through some other evidence of concealing what they were doing, filing of false documents. There's been a report of a false retainer agreement, for example, from Michael Cohen. That could show that they knew what they were doing was illegal, and so they needed to cover it up in some way. And
Does
so,
Donald Trump, on your point, does Donald Trump, Barbara, lying about it and famously saying on Air Force One, ask Michael Cohen, and saying he didn't know about it, does that go to that kind of evidence you're talking about?
Absolutely. Anytime somebody is lying and covering something up or acting in an unusual way, you wonder why would they do that? And one of the reasons could be consciousness of guilt. I know that what I did was wrong, and that's what caused me to lie about it. So, yes, that would be additional evidence to prove that willful intent.
John, I want to take this out further because I do think what Michael Cohen testified to is significant for the details and evidence provided. Not for the opinions provided, of which there were some, but the evidence. And as you know, prosecutors aren't normal people. No offense to either of you. Prosecutors look at leads the way the rest of us look at ice cream or a nice big cinnamon roll. They get excited. And I say that as introduction to a former prosecutor, Chris Christie, who we know is sympathetic to Trump. But being the ice cream loving prosecutor that he is, and I mean that with regard to investigative leads, he got so excited about the fact that Michael Cohen uncorked a bunch of leads, he just sort of started walking through the leads. Take a look.
Well, what he really did yesterday was create a whole bunch of additional witnesses that the House is now empowered to try to bring before them. Folks like Alan Weisselberg at the Trump Organization, who he must have mentioned a dozen times. The president's children, who he said was involved in the hush money payments and others, right? So what he did yesterday was set all that up.
John, how do you view that? Do you agree? Because a lot of other Trump defenders were saying, I want to talk about Michael Cohen's credibility. Chris Christie, a former U.S. attorney, ended up saying, gosh, look at those names. Those are the people you're going to want to talk to.
He saw nothing but rum raisin ice cream, apparently. The defense of the Republicans, just to call him a liar, only goes so far in any kind of competition like this. And he was lying for a liar. And what were the lies about? The lies were about concealing what Trump had done that was wrong and illegal. And the list of names, those are not new. But what he did was he created a situation in which now publicly we have our witness list, and we're going to probably work through it. Some people say prosecutors are going to be upset about that. Well, in a normal case, they would, but our system is not working. Our checks and balances aren't working. People who should be standing up to the White House are not doing it. We are in a very special crisis in America, and the People's House is going to do something about it. And the election that we won is going to enable us to have a good and fair and Republican government like we haven't had for the 2 years before the midterm elections. And so whatever they do to compromise Mueller or whatever they try to do to shut down the Southern District of New York, they are going to have to deal with the information, and that makes a difference. Jefferson said, a nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. And the people are going to get the information, and they're going to react to it, I believe.
Fascinating. John, thank you. Barbara, I'm going to see you later in the show. We have to fit something in right now. Breaking news on this Friday night. House Democrats are now moving forward on what is widely expected to be an epic showdown to get, legally, Donald Trump's tax returns. We have NBC reporting from Washington right now. The House committee with the authority to get these taxes is moving forward on the steps for something we've discussed previously, a formal request to the IRS, lawyers working explicitly on language. The chair of that committee, Richard Neal, working with other top Democrats who are involved in order to strengthen the legal case. This is an advancement of a story we've been tracking. And Jason Johnson in Washington is for us from TheRoot.com. What is the news tonight?
Well, the news is that you've got Ways and Means that they're going to formally ask for the president's tax returns. But Ari, this has to do also with what we saw earlier this week with the Oversight Committee. Now, the Oversight Committee could ask for the president's tax returns, but they would have to basically subpoena them, and then you would have a big court battle. Ways and Means can actually say, look, we want the president's tax returns. But the catch is this. They can't just say, you know, how many M's you got in your bank account. They can't just demand it. They have to say, we need your tax returns in order to pass a certain kind of law. So that's why the language is important.
Can they ask how many commas, Jason?
They could ask how many commas. They could ask how many commas he got.
I have a U.S. Senator standing by, but on this breaking news, I now turn to ask you the analysis. There has been so much talk about Trump's tax returns for so long. What do you see as the import of this coming against the backdrop of the Cohen hearings?
Well, there's two things. Number one, you notice that Ocasio-Cortez, in the hearings, she mentioned, Trump's golf course and inflating the taxes. That is in the Southern District of New York. So it already becomes a legal issue if they're interested in the tax returns for that case. But also, this is the kind of thing that could be used for the Russia investigation. This could be used to pass future laws about what happens if people try and deflate their assets. There are multiple ways this leads to not only investigations, but possibly new laws.
It's very interesting given the sequential way we've seen, as you mentioned, multiple Democrats working on this. Thank you, Jason. We keep moving forward, as I mentioned, because Senator Richard Blumenthal is here with me in New York. This is one part of the story. Michael Cohen's testimony sparking all kinds of investigative leads on the congressional side. The Oversight Committee now wants to hear from Don Jr. and Ivanka Trump. The Intel Committee pushing to question the money man himself, Donald Trump's longtime CFO, Allen Weisselberg. Then you have Felix Sater, who was, of course, a key player in Trump Tower Moscow, and also has worked with the FBI, set to testify later this month. And then, of course, the multiple committees, as reported tonight, interested in Donald Trump's tax returns. Add to that Financial Services Chair Maxine Waters with new questions that dig into use and potential abuse of funds by the Trump Foundation. I want to bring in Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal, a former prosecutor himself, who serves on the Judiciary Committee. Thanks for being on the beat tonight.
Thank you very much.
A lot to talk about, but let's begin with the tax returns. What can you tell us about that process of something Democrats have long wanted to do, but it seems now, are these, in your view, concrete steps?
These are very concrete steps, and they are made necessary by the Ways and Means Committee wanting to legislate in this area and protect the public against the kind of tax fraud that was revealed very dramatically in the Cohen hearings, inflating the values of properties to insurance companies or banks. That's fraud. Against the law.
I mean, this is important. You view what Cohen outlined there as, and he said it under oath, if true, and there was some documentation, that alone already meets the bar as fraud by Donald Trump?
That's fraud against those insurance companies. It's bank fraud. It could be fraud against the government. Also, deflating the values for tax purposes. That's tax fraud. So these financial crimes are very consequential. That's a very good reason to want those tax returns and to have good legal reason for them. But also, I think what's striking about the Cohen testimony is the kind of Pandora's box it opened. Not only in terms of witnesses, but also potential crimes. Very few people focused on those financial crimes, which are within the Southern District of New York. As you said before, a lot of prosecutorial ears opened wide and eyes, frankly, at some of what Cohen said about those checks. You mentioned them earlier, and you showed them. They were written and discussed in the Oval Office. In the Oval Office, after Trump became president. So I think the timing is very important. As Barbara and John mentioned, two great lawyers, that the potential for conspiracy there involves literally the seat of government. And I think all of the Cohen testimony is very consequential in that way.
Yeah, it seemed like a significant thing, even in a time where people are somewhat inured to how many breaking stories there are. I want to widen out and talk about something that was so obvious. It may not need that much discussion, but you're here and you think through these issues on the Judiciary Committee. Take a listen to one of the most absurd lines of attack on Michael Cohen, which was Republicans hammering him for being an alleged liar in the service and defense of a president who has been documented to lie more than any politician in American history. Take a look.
Our first big hearing with, as you and we all know, a convicted liar, lying to Congress.
You're a pathological liar. And look at the old adage that our moms taught us, liar, liar, pants on fire.
He's going to prison for lying to Congress, and he's the star witness to Congress.
You know, it's just one more example, Mr. Cohen, of you skirting the truth.
Isn't it absurd for that to be the line in defense of Donald Trump?
Well, the defense of Donald Trump is going to fall and crumble pretty quickly if that's the defense. But remember about Michael Cohen. he has everything to lose and nothing to gain by lying now. Any lie he tells will be quickly a reason to deepen and aggravate the amount of time, already 3 years, he's going to spend behind bars. And Robert Mueller knows everything already that he is telling to Congress. And remember also, and as a former prosecutor, perhaps not normal, as you said, as a person, and now I'm a senator.
The things that get you interested,
so I'm doubly not normal. But remember, the arguments we make to juries using witnesses who have committed crimes, they're not choir boys. You can't have choir boys to prove these kinds of serious crimes. Right. And we tell juries, don't leave your common sense at the door. The court here is the court of public opinion, not a jury in a courtroom, but the same kind of approach has to apply. The American people have to use their common sense.
I think, Senator, you make such an important point, because that's why this was different. There is something in common, as you know. A jury and the court of public opinion are both made up of regular citizens who have what we would call a BS detector for some of what the folks in the building that you serve in do, for some of the grandiosity of partisan speeches. But this week wasn't about partisan speeches. It was about this guy who was riding with Donald Trump for 10 years. And so the American people can listen to him and figure out what seems credible or not when he has so much to lose if he lies now. And look at the character of the man presented. I want to get your response, of course. And then Jason Johnson, I want to ask as well about the Kushner security clearance.
And there's corroboration here. There are documents. There are other witnesses. We're going to hear from those other witnesses. And what is so striking about what Donald Trump did was he was willing to solicit and accept help from a foreign, hostile adversary, the Russian government, to help him get elected. And that kind of threat to our national security, we're seeing it again in the security clearance given improperly to Jared Kushner because the president overruled his own intelligence and security advisors and professionals, I think speaks fundamentally to why you saw nobody defending Donald Trump as a person. All of it was attacking Cohen.
Right, which I think is telling. Senator Richard Blumenthal, as you say, former prosecutor and U.S. Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with me on Set on the Beat. Before we go, Jason Johnson's been following these stories for us, and the last one is, Jason, the New York Times has basically documented the allegation that Donald Trump and his family members lied about nepotistic overruling of the intelligence community to rush out a clearance for Jared Kushner. What do you believe matters about that story as everything else is going on?
That basically we run the risk of our national security being for sale across the world. Look, at a very basic level, Ari, whether you're in the FBI or CIA and anything else like that, you can't get security clearance if you have a certain debt-to-income ratio. And so under most circumstances, Jared Kushner would never be allowed to get access to this kind of information because he owes so much money and he's got so much that he might want to leverage. So the fact that the president stepped in and said, hey, you can still get into the club, sneak in the back, and went over our national security, so much so that even Kelly felt like he needed to write a memo to say I wasn't in favor of this, indicates how dangerous our national security has been compromised by Jared Kushner.
Yeah. Jason Johnson, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.